After 2.5 years, Legends of Runeterra finally released my favorite League of Legends champion, Kayle. Normally, I'd be elated to see this happen, as I was with the addition of Taliyah and Bard, but there's just one little problem. Kayle sucks. Surely though, if there are 10 regions, not including Runeterrans, there must be a good deck for Kayle out there somewhere, so I just had to try them all. Also, if you're interested, I've uploaded the full commentaries for almost all of these decks on my other channel, A Shiny Sylveon. There's a link in the description below. When Kayle was revealed, the deck that was on everyone's mind was Bard Kayle. Buff elusive units with chimes and win games with big stat sticks that are impossible to remove. It seems fine on paper, but with it being a Kayle deck, I had my doubts going into this first mini-session. After all, following Bard's nerf, it seemed even more unlikely that the champion would be able to ramp up fast enough to make a dent in Kayle's already dismal win rate. With my expectations set low, I went into my first match with fear and trepidation, which was made even worse when I saw Braum Karma pop up. It wasn't so much that it was Braum and Karma specifically, but more that I was worried about the region combo, Freljord and Ionia. You see, Kayle has a couple of inherent weaknesses. In order to level up, her allies have to be attacking with raised stats consistently, and then she has to be played from hand, and then she has to wait around to level up. Her level up is constituent on being able to stay on board with all of her stats available. Ionia has recalls, which places the 6-mana champion back in hand, and Freljord has frostbites, which removes the effects of her empowered bonuses. Nevertheless, I was blessed with great RNG for this match. I had the perfect bird into Esma's curve and opted in for a stun on Braum here instead of outright killing him, because I figured they might be sitting on a troll chant and wouldn't want him to develop another blocker for free should the 2-mana unit die instead. On my following attack, I knocked my opponent down to 1 HP while having only 1 elusive unit on board, which that is a lot of damage going through. They have a troll chant that they're holding. They were holding it last turn. That is so much damage to take. I still have an elusive unit. I mean, yeah, sure, you want to keep your board control, but 1 HP is not a difficult number for me to push through with this deck. I continued developing even more elusive units than I figured they could handle, and won the game on turn 7. And even if it was an off-meta deck, and even if my opponent absolutely threw the match by passing a block to keep a Braum alive, I felt pretty good about this first game's result. Maybe Targon Bard isn't such a bad deck after all? Alright, who here is actually excited when they play Demacia decks? My next opponent was playing Aatrox Quinn Vayne even after the hotfix nerf. I suppose if I liked the deck well enough, I'd do the same thing, keep trying to play the deck after the nerf, but what really got me going was how this was the longest match I played, and it was against Demacia. You might as well have set me on fire for 23 minutes. The match length was partially due to the game going on late, but mostly due to my opponent taking half an era to decide their turns. I'd understand this with other decks, but this is Aatrox Vayne, the ultimate play big unit and rally deck. What is there to decide outside of play big unit and rally? Well, I mean, there is that too. When we both ran our hands out, I was constantly worried about my adversary having some specific cards. Sometimes it would be another Aatrox or another fish fight or any sort of interaction. As it turned out though, most of their hand ended up being equipment until they found Vayne. And yet, despite their best efforts to tumble at me and throw overwhelmed units my way, I found myself at 1 HP before I was able to swing back with a lethal Kayle. Before I did though, I would like to berate this denizen of hell, Azazel, and blame them for their sins. Just before I had lethal, I had 0 cards in hand. I knew that in order to win, I'd have to play Esmus to buff Kayle enough for the overwhelming damage to stick. Instead, what happened was my opponent played Catch on their Petricite Broadwing, equipped the Darkened Spear from hand, and then tumbled Aatrox. If Catch was used for the +1/+1 buff, Aatrox would have had lethal right here. Due to some misclick or genuine misunderstanding, I won the game on a fluke. I mean, don't worry about it. We'll discuss the PayPal later. The third game was a blast from the past, a classic Feel the Rush with Trundle and Tryndamere, no Lysandra in sight. I was admittedly pretty scared of this deck. I don't have Deny or any form of recall to handle big units. All I had was Cosmic Binding and a Dream. I'll skip over the exact details, but what ended up happening was that my opponent didn't draw their necessary units to win. They had their ramp all readily available, but I piled on too much pressure and gradually beat them to death with big stats. They, on the other hand, didn't find Feel the Rush or either of their champions. Aside from a She Who Wanders that was played way later into the game, I never felt like I was far behind and pressed my advantage the whole way through. What followed afterwards was a much more interesting game indeed. I found myself at the mercy of Zed Hecarim, a deck that necessitated more early game units than ever before. You see, Kayle is a weird archetype because of how she requires early game units to buff themselves, ultimately for a late game win condition. My proudest moment was when I passed on turn 2 to save the spell mana for turn 3, allowing me to use Cosmic Binding and kill a Zed as soon as he hit the board. Momentous choice might have been a consideration, but I knew that I had to deal with the champion before he could become a real threat. I tried swinging for lethal on turn 8 with Bard, but low-rolled the Chimes, but still, the Chimes seriously buffed up the units both on board and in my hand, and I had a rather robust board going into the next turn. Since my stats were simply bigger than theirs, I blocked all of their units, and then hit them with the double attack Kayle for a victorious Game 4. Game 5 was an interesting one for sure. This time I was playing against Grandpa Roji's creation, a deck that I like to call the Cultist's Bounty, and a deck with a lot of interaction.
Ooh, okay, I like this deck. This is going to be a tough one.
And it turns out that I was partially right. Well, honestly, the match was pretty touch and go for the majority of it, but on this particular turn, I got too greedy and tried to kill Varus while completely forgetting what the Varus card does. Ultimately, I felt like I could chalk this loss up to not paying attention to small details, but in the end, Bard Kayle had an 80% win rate. Not bad at all. Better than the results that would follow it, at least. Now, according to my fellow content creator Visionary Decks, I am the unluckiest player known to mankind. One time, on stream, I ran into a Nora deck that created a free rainbow fish from a portal, so every time that I killed the unit that had the rainbow fish on it, they kept replaying it for free for the rest of the game. So I don't want to say that I played Rico Rex's Zoe Kayle Noxus aggro deck poorly, I just got extremely unlucky in multiple circumstances. 2 games were winnable for me if it weren't for some exceedingly slim chances that my opponent seemed to be grappling with, and 2 games I outright won before I could realistically play Kayle. I faced deep, and that did not go well at all. Aggro decks versus 2 Deadbloom Wanderers. Yeah, that didn't work out. I faced Lurk, and that went extremely well. It always feels good when you're facing Lurk and your opponent misses it on turn 1. The nail in the coffin was that I pulled Crescent Strike from Zoe's super cool star chart and sniped an attack that was a lot scarier than it looked. I played a match against Bard Lee Sin that I frankly didn't know what to expect, so I told them to expect this super. But funny enough, it was after this game against Bard Lee Sin that I started to realize that this deck was good without Kayle. Most of my games were resolved by the timer even before I could play her on board, so it seemed to me like the archetype could benefit better from a different, more aggressive champion. My next opponent was a rematch against the same Hecarim Zed player from earlier, and this is where my luck hit rock bottom. See, since we were playing a more aggressive deck, the innate healing and unit swarm that was able to keep up with our own was something of a problem. But funny enough, I still managed to keep up with them for the whole match and was about to win when... Oh, no way! What a top deck! Oh. Well, you know, happens to the best of us. Final match was Nightfall Aggro, Aphelios Diana, which indicated to me that this person wanted to play as many Nightfall cards as possible, which included all 3 copies of Aphelios, all 3 copies of Unspeakable Horror, 2 Dusk Riders that had the power that was well into the double digits, and I did admittedly misplay on 1 occasion. Here, I was going to swing for a possible lethal, and was planning to play around another Unspeakable Horror, but the problem was that I gave this 1 health unit a free block on one of my units, and I should have swapped these 2, giving them the option of letting my Crescent Guardian through and keeping the Solari Soldier on board, but ultimately lost it because I honestly played this game too fast. So that's unfortunately where the Noxus deck ended, going a paltry 2 for 3. Bandle City was an abysmal failure. Aside from some cool combos that I managed to pull off, I never really found that Kayle fit into the general Bandle City swarm strategy. Maybe this would have worked better if I tried the Fae package, but even that feels relatively slow and extremely susceptible to every anti-combat tool in the book. And there was one game I had against Rise where my opponent had 3 recalls, 2 stuns, 2 Eye of Nagagaboros cards, 1 drum solo, and got 2 Rises off of it. For a deck that relies on beating your face in with big statted units, having them reset in my hand multiple times was very frustrating. The other matches were against Shen Fiora, Rek'Sai Pyke, Trundle Tryndamere, and Udyr Victor. Bandle City joins Noxus in the 40% win rate gang. Pyke Kayle was an idea I had at the start of the expansion but never published because it wasn't much fun trying to find Ripper's Bay. Snooey, on the other hand, published a video featuring this archetype specifically, and I liked his list a lot better, so I ran it in ranked. The general idea is to use Ripper's Bay to make every unit a lurk unit, and that way they all have increased power and contribute to Kayle's level up every time they attack. The first win was one that I'm going to savor for a very long time, because it was indeed against Kayn Vayne. In all honesty, I shouldn't have won this match, but there were 2 things that particularly infuriated me. For one, my opponent sat on a 0 mana tumble with a weapon that gave +2/+3 and impact. If they played this early on, they could have equipped the weapon and leveled their Kayn here for free and been a whole entire turn ahead of me, but they never played it. The second thing that frustrated me was, well, I'll just let the clip play out for you here. Single combat here, I guess? No, you single combat this. You single combat Rost onto Winged Messenger. Heal 2 HP, heal Rost to full. You still have Tumble left over to swing back for a ton of damage. What? Why am I winning this match? I have double attack! You lose! Ah. Demacia players. But then, there was this match immediately afterwards where despite my efforts to keep the Black Flame off of the board, my opponent had all 3 copies of it. The traps gradually became too much for my board to handle, and regardless of the result though, the only other match I lost was against Ezreal Seraphine, while I beat Red Gwen and Trundle Lissandra with Ionia. Pyke Kayle, 60% win rate, but absolutely a fluke when the Demacia player is considered. Akshan Kayle. Look, I'm not saying that the deck is bad, but both of the matches that I won were ones where my opponent surrendered immediately, so I guess it's good? Gwen Kayle was yet another resounding failure. While it sounds good on paper, it's not all that good in practice. I did manage to beat Zed Gwen with it, and somehow outmaneuvered a Senna Ezreal deck, but lost to Caitlyn Teemo thanks to a Mystic Shot top deck, lost to Braum Kayle, which happens to be a bigger deck that can run Frostbites, and Black Flame Talia was a bit hard for me to handle. There were definitely ways for me to win each of these matches, but the results speak for themselves. Another 2 for 3 exchange. In Ionia, the only champion I could really think to pair Kayle with was Zed because of how much Zed likes having buffs. I had the idea of spamming out Zed units and a Darkin fan to buff up a sparring student, which actually worked out more often than I expected it to. But in reality, the only deck I felt I struggled against was the Karma and Nivea deck. The other loss was some unfortunate RNG, so I can't be too terribly upset about it. Even if poor Sylveon here was using a default deck, well, a win's a win. With Piltover and Zaun, I cheated slightly and included 1 copy of Aphelios, then tried to lean into the augment package with Victor. I went back to the Runeterra champions, and realistically the only ones that worked here were Aatrox and Jax, the latter of which was basically a weaker version of the former. For a moment I did consider Evelynn and Varus and Kayn, but for my own reasons I ultimately decided against playing them, and in regards to Jhin, and what the fuck am I supposed to do with this? My second Runeterra attempt was with Jax, which had some alright results because of the Weapon Master package, though its limitations were most apparent in its reach Weapon Masters are a solid mid-range deck archetype, but the problem is that that's kind of the only thing it does. It doesn't have access to powerful units to get around opposing units more readily, like Red Gwen and the Fallen Reckoners, not to mention a lack of access to highly necessary rally cards. But regardless of what I think though, I still went 3 for 2 with Jack's Kayle, which genuinely surprised me. The losses were interesting learning points though because of how quickly they highlighted the problems with the Weapon Master package, and that is interaction. How are you going to tell me that Ionian Hookmaster is a Weapon Master that can create Fischl Whack, but Fishfight is not a Weapon Master card and is instead locked to Demacia only? At any rate, Zoe wouldn't have lived for as long as she did if I had the card, and I probably would have had a fighting chance against Aatrox Kayn, but the results of those games remain as they are. Even so, I still somehow won 3 games with this deck. I beat Black Flame Talia Ziggs by having a better mid-range board, I beat Pantheon Yuumi Kayle because my opponent never found Pantheon, and finally Nasus Kindred was a win for me, as they never found the right cards to activate their champions, and I ran away with the match pretty early on. Aatrox Kayle, on the other hand, is a deck that will haunt me for as long as this video retains relevance. Since both champions are 6 costs, they are often contending in mana slots with each other, and Aatrox is the vastly superior one. When Aatrox is summoned, he heals the Nexus by 2 and regenerates his health at the end of the round. Then, oh, I punched my water bottle. Then, when he survives an attack and a block, he'll heal for 2 more per strike. With the right cards and buffs, he can be a 7/7 unit on drop that heals your Nexus for 6 HP. That leaves us with only one region, Freljord, and I honestly enjoy this deck the most out of all of them. Yeah, Freljord is a weak region, and yeah, Kayle kind of sucks too, but the one thing that Freljord does exceptionally well is spread his buffs while giving control synergy with Targon. Unleash Spirits, Revna, and Buried in Ice are some of the highlight cards here as we use Braum to stabilize in the early game, then crush our opponents with big late game swings. It's pretty mid-rangey with a fairly decent control ability. With that all said, here's how the games went on with what I consider to be the best Kayle deck of them all. Game number 1 was against Darkness. Classic Senna Veigar Darkness in the year of our Lord 2023. Yeah, this game was Darkness, for those of you who don't know the deck, has a propensity for winning through min-maxing interaction. I'm honestly impressed with the deck because of how particularly good it is at playing efficiently should the cards line up, and boy oh boy did they line up for my opponent. I tried to remove a Veigar from the board early on, but was denied by a main deck stress defense. I was outpaced by Missed Call on a couple of occasions, and when my opponent's Darkness reached 6 damage because of how I struggled to remove Veigar early, they leveled him and brought him back with a Rekindler. Game number 2 was a bit better as we found ourselves at the mercy of Targon's Pyke. Fortunately for me, despite all of their attempts to curve out early on, they didn't find the Pyke until much later in the game. I was also incredibly lucky as the delay in the game plan allowed me to drop multiple Revnas, resulting in things like this. Even if an FTR was dropped later, my board simply didn't care about the large champions because how are they going to block this super? Yeah, you better run. For a second game in a row, I faced Targon and Freljord, though this time it was Pantheon and Udyr, the ultimate muscle man deck. This match was much closer, though I won it because my opponent didn't play a single Overwhelm stance. The Merkwolf Shaman has regen naturally, but every single other unit that you see on this board received the regen stance from Udyr's stance swap. To make matters worse for themselves, there was also a Troll Gifts involved that granted Udyr +2 attack with no overwhelm. If any other unit aside from Removal had even a smidgen of overwhelm, I was toast. Instead, I rejected those carbs and obtained some sweet victory because of a 1-mana unit. And looking back, even though I made the wrong block here, I still won the match. Revenge. Best served cold. And apparently I had happened to log in on Freljord Day. Gracing my presence was an old enemy of mine, Trundle Tryndamere FTR. So how did we fare against it using the deck that we have now? Not too great. I couldn't really find the units I needed to ramp my deck up while my opponent dropped the perfect hand to curve into FTR, and I wasn't ready to stick around to find out if they had it. I just knew we were screwed from the moment I missed out on all of these things. Last opponent, but certainly not least of all for Braum Kayle, was a Plunder deck. Classic Plunder with a twist. They too happened to main deck Unleash Spirits, but the joke was on them because of how, once again, Revna's stats gave way to another beefed up Divine Clerk. The 13 HP my opponent had worked so hard to remove from my Nexus magically went up and way out of the realm of danger. With my significantly larger units and the help of a Sunburst, I prevented Sejuani from being too much of a threat, and then just kept increasing the pressure until I punched them in the mouth for lethal damage. Even if the deck didn't perform as well as the Bard deck, I felt much more satisfied with the results of Braum and Kayle. It feels consistent, it feels like every unit matters in the deck, and it's my personal recommendation for Kayle decks, even if the rest of them aren't all that great. And that's all of the regions. I absolutely did not miss out on playing any particular one because of personal biases. Well, don't believe me? Just watch the video again. Maybe you missed it. Okay, fine, we'll play the Demacia deck. And that concludes my attempt at finding the best Kayle deck. If we're to go by win rate with this overall sample size, the Bard deck is the one that performed the best. Across 60 games, we ended up with a 47% win rate overall, a lot of which was nothing but pain and suffering. Oh no, I lost with the Demacia deck. Oh man. Oh wow. Oh, that's, you know what? My heart goes out to nobody, actually, because it's a Demacia deck and I don't care. Odds are I'll keep playing the Braum Kayle deck because it really is my favorite one of the lot, but until Kayle's level up condition is buffed, I highly doubt that I'll be playing many other decks featuring her in the near future. Thank you all so very much for sitting through this video. I appreciate your time, and I hope you're staying safe out there this time of year. That's all I have. Safe travels, and goodbye.